Welcome again, everyone. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us, and thank you for joining a great conversation here about topics that are really interesting and important to me, and I'm sure to all of you out there that are working in schools. My guest today is Dr. Hayley Watson. She is a clinical psychologist who holds a PhD in school bullying interventions, along with 4 further degrees in the field of mental health. Hayley has been creating and delivering programs for youth and practitioners across the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia for the past 20 years. And she is the founder and CEO of Open Parachute, a Tier 1 K-12 curriculum program that supports the mental health of students, teachers, and parents. Her book is called Finding the Words: Empowering Struggling Students Through Guided Conversations. Hayley, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start with something that I think will contextualize what this book's about and how it sort of fits into the hands of those who will use it, which is, in your definition, what is the job of an educator?
Great question. So I would say the job of an educator is to educate our young people. And when I say the word educate and when I think of educate, there's of course curriculum. That's what we typically comes to mind. But what I think is the most valuable and incredible role that educators fulfill is really the education of our children as human beings. How do we create humans that are fully engaged and able to thrive in their lives? And that's a big ask. And that's a thing that you can look at in a job you can look at in all different ways. But I think educators do a brilliant job of this because of the relationships they form, because of the communication and interactions they have. And so it's really about educating that whole human. How do we make sure that we're not just getting them across the finish line of high school, but how do we make sure that when they are out in the world, they are kind and compassionate human beings?
Yeah. And so, kind of with that in mind, but then drilling down on what the book is, as best as you can, what is the one sentence goal of this book? Like, to tell a potential read, when you pick this book up, this is what it's going to help you do.
So, as an educator, this book helps you have difficult or awkward or slightly challenging conversations with students who are struggling with their mental health in some capacity. And I think it's important. I know you said one sentence, but that's hard for me to qualify that just a
Sure.
little bit with this is not about becoming a psychologist or a therapist or having to fix or change any of the challenges students are facing. It's really about the fact that educators are faced with these circumstances that their students are facing every single day. And in order to be able to feel okay in that role and to feel safe in that role and to feel not overwhelmed with that as an educator, this book is designed to empower for those moments where it's that question, what do I say? I know this student is really struggling or is really sad or just lost someone or something's going on at home, but I don't know what to say. So either I don't say anything at all and then feel bad about it, or I say something and I'm not sure if it was the right thing, or there's this whole stress that is involved in that for educators. And so the goal is to empower educators to say, here's some simple things you can say that you know are helping. And so that not only does that help the educator, but also students then have multiple adults in their lives that are supporting them. Not, again, not being their therapist, but really just saying those few things that they need in those moments when they need them most.
Yeah, and your answer about having a few of the right things to say to support students who are struggling in some way with their mental health leads naturally into, I think, an important question, which is, what is mental health? And I think the evolution of societal understanding of that
Mhm.
has taken a positive trajectory, but I almost wonder in some ways if it has gotten so broad that
Mhm.
sometimes it's hard to track exactly what it refers to when we really are
Mhm.
paying close attention to the words we use in those terms, and
Mhm.
understanding that it's something that impacts everybody, that it's not just
Yeah.
siloed off, or it is a specific set of disorders, right?
Mm.
But at the same time, the words mean something. So
Yeah.
can you kind of define that so that
Mhm.
everybody listening is on the same page?
Yes. And I really love everything you were saying there. When I use the term mental health, it's not about diagnoses. It's not about separating people based on certain qualities or characteristics. And exactly as you said, mental health is something we all have. And so when we're talking about someone struggling with their mental health, it's the natural response as a human being when we face something hard for our mind to do something. Sometimes the something that our mind does is helpful because we've learned a few strategies. And sometimes that something that our mind does is unhelpful because we're in a fight or flight response. We're panicked. We don't have the resources to support ourselves. And the things we do in that state are mental health reactions. So maybe that's we suppress our feelings and we don't say anything about it because we don't think we can. Maybe that's we lash out and we get angry. Maybe it's that we think though everything's terrible and we have nothing, we can't help ourselves. Or maybe we just freeze and panic. There's so many different things that we do. Sometimes we people please. So sometimes the students that look completely fine are really struggling because their response when they're under stress is to pretend everything's fine. So it's almost less about what it looks like and trying to figure out what's the issue or how can I understand it. We don't really need to do that necessarily, especially as educators. It's more about that recognition. You're a human and you're facing something hard and you're having a reaction in your mind about it. And so that's mental health. And again, sometimes it's really positive reactions, sometimes it's really unhelpful reactions. None of it's bad or good in a judgmental sense because we all do it, but it's about how do we help navigate and help teach students that when their mind is doing something unhelpful, there are tools and strategies to make a more helpful choice.
Are there particular signs or elements of mental health that are most relevant to students at their, whether it's at kind of particular age cohorts or as they're going through school, that are most critical for educators, parents, other adults in their lives to be paying attention to, that helps to narrow it down even a little more? Because I'm
Yeah.
sure when we're talking about adolescence or all these things that are
Mhm.
happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything happening with students is unique only to kids. But
Mhm.
I'm sure there are things that are most common, happening more frequently with students as compared to adults or other people.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a few things, and a lot of it is related to peer challenges because it's a when you think about as an adult, imagine your whole life is dictated and you have to go somewhere where you don't necessarily know everyone, or you have to go to a new job every few years, or you're in this huge group of people that you might not get along with, and you're kind of forced to socialize with them. That's what it's like for students. So there's a lot of things that come out of those peer group challenges. And then also there's a lot of things that come out of just the stress of school. It's not an easy place for a lot of students. And so those two big challenges, and then of course things that are happening at home. And so what does that look like for students and their mental health? One of the things that can happen is students, of course, can get quite anxious. So, and that's again, not unique to young people, but the things they're anxious about, this is where anxiety often starts because it's that what are people thinking about me? And that's really
Mhm.
at that age developmentally, young people are really primed to be looking to their peer groups because that's their safety network. And so there is that fear that starts developing of I need to impress my peers and I need to be acceptable to them. And that can look like worry and those kinds of things. It can also look like changing to try to fit in, which is another symptom of anxiety, doing people pleasing, doing things that your friends are doing. And even sometimes that can be unkind actions. There's someone in my peer group that's being really mean to someone else, and I'm going to join in because I'm anxious about that and I want to please them. So there's all of those pieces around it. Then there's sort of that low mood and isolation. And again, adults experience this too, but it can be especially poignant for young people, especially with social media and this whole experience of I'm alone and I'm not loved and I'm not valued and I'm not respected, that can be really strong for young people. And especially because they've never, as adults, we've gone through low periods and we've come out the other side often for most of us. Of course, some adults are really in a low period and they haven't come out of it. And that's also really devastating. But for young people, they really have not, they haven't had these experiences to know that things will pass. And so
Right.
this is why we get these devastating outcomes where students take their own life or they have these tragic experiences because it feels so all-encompassing, the rejection that they feel just because kids at school don't like them or are being rude to them. And we look at that and go, don't you know that you're loved in all these other ways? And maybe there's also struggles at home, etc. But even just that peer rejection, they don't know that they're loved. If they show up at school and everyone's mean to them, they don't have that life experience to say, hey, maybe this is just, these just aren't my people, and I need to find
Right.
my people somewhere else. So that becomes a really difficult challenge. And then this stuff can come out interpersonally as well. So kids can get picked on a lot because they're feeling so low about themselves. And they're sort of kids pick up on that, other kids pick up on that, and it's an easy target. And then other kids are mean because they don't know what else to do with those feelings and those sadness. And so they're projecting it onto other people. So these are some of, again, it's a lot around that peer group. And then when you talk about sort of education challenges, that can also look very different. So when a student is struggling with school, sometimes that means they're not paying attention and they're not focusing, and that's what it looks like. And that you see that a lot. Sometimes it means they start acting out. Sometimes they start avoiding school. So this is really important. Kids that look like they don't care, look like they just couldn't care less about school or are skipping school, that's usually because something in school is really hard and it's scary for them and it's confronting for them and it makes them feel like they're not smart enough and those kinds of things. So again, there's so many things that can be happening, but those are some of the key ones that we see a lot in students.
Yeah, you certainly identified some important ones, and also I think adds more understanding around how to find the right words, have the right things to
Hmm.
say to navigate between being actually helpful without being
Hmm.
dismissive, without reading the wrong thing into it, right? And there's a lot
Hmm.
of things that when we get to a certain age of adulthood and we look back and say, all that stuff that I was so worried about back then
Yeah.
doesn't matter at all, right? By the time you're 22 or 25, or you'll never think
Yeah.
about it again. But at that moment, it's your only
Hmm.
experience. You don't have a different perspective. And it's the rare teenager
Hmm.
who has that level of self certainty to think,
Hmm.
I'm not worried about this. It's
Yeah.
really common. But
Hmm.
I think for an adult to just say, yeah, none of this stuff's going to matter in the future, that's not really going to necessarily strike the
Yeah.
right tone either.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes that's the case. The thing that we naturally kind of comes to mind is not necessarily the thing that's going to be the most helpful. And so that's where educators get stuck because they might sense that and go, well, I don't know, I'm not trained in this, I'm not sure, but really the only thing they're missing is that framework. Just like we all know some basic CPR. So when we're at the scene of a crime, or sorry, I say crime because I have a criminology background. If we're at the scene of an emergency, we do have a few things that we can draw on in that moment. But if we haven't taken CPR, we have no idea. We would just freeze and panic or just do something that's wildly unhelpful.
Right.
Same thing with mental health. And so that's the purpose of this book, to give just this basic framework so that in those moments, a few words can pop into your mind because you've read them and you've looked at them and you engage in them and you go, all right, okay, I do know that there is a couple things I can say here, not to fix the whole situation, but just to help in this moment to get them to the next moment where they can help themselves more.
Yeah. So within the framework, the structure of the book, we'll get into some of the specifics, some of how it breaks down. But as far as getting there, like getting to the point of feeling like one can engage with this, what are some of the internal hurdles that educators typically need to overcome to feel like I am qualified to do what my part in this is, right? I'm not a mental health professional, but as far as some of the basics of being able to support students with their mental health, and being able to at least play a role in that and have some awareness of it. What are some of, I guess, the limiting beliefs to address there, or some of the things that you would push back against and say, no, you can do this, you are qualified, and here's what that looks like?
Yeah, a great question. So I think the biggest one comes in the terminology of mental health. So when you hear the word mental health as an educator, even as a parent, all of a sudden there's these alarm bells that go off because there's sort of this big unknown. And we do have quote unquote experts, which again, I'm a psychologist, so I would be in that camp of these are the people that have had all this training and they're the only ones. And that's, I would say, a limiting belief in our culture. So it's not the fault of you as an educator or you as a parent or us as adults to think that. That's just a natural thing that we all think because that's what we've been told. These are the people that you can go to. Now, it's important, of course, to have those people and to have those specialized conversations and therapy when it's appropriate and all those things. But it's almost when you're thinking as an educator, remove the word mental health from it and just think of, I know how to connect to my students. I know how to relate to my students. I know how to care about my students, and I know how to support my students. You know these things. And so it's just the word mental health that sometimes can create that block to think, oh, is this something different than all of that? And I think that's the biggest hurdle to overcome. It is no different than any of that. It is exactly that. It's just taking it one tiny step forward further to say, how does all the things I'm doing already apply in this maybe slightly different circumstance? So I know how to help students through their homework. I know how to help students through an interpersonal challenge that's happening in the classroom. So let's just apply all of those same skills and let's put it into a student that's anxious or a student that's disengaged from school or a student whose parents just separated. And again, it's just knowing that the same skills that you already possess are just going to be tweaked a little bit to apply there. And I think that's the biggest one because educators are fantastic at all of these things. It's just that confidence level of knowing I can do this because I've done it before in a different circumstance.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that for a lot of people who are not professionals, and whether they're educators or in any other position, that they're trying to operate by whatever their version of the do no harm principle would be, right?
Mhm.
And a lot
Mhm.
of times that leads
Yeah.
to paralysis or just choosing not to
Yes.
do something versus to do
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
And I mean, sometimes I think about how that might apply to other parts of the teaching role and with
Mhm.
instruction and stuff, where like there's like pressure to do something because it's you're having, it's like, this is, at least I'm justifying that I'm doing my job and I'm doing some things that I don't even know if they're the right things to
Yeah.
do, but at least nobody can say I didn't do something. But
Mhm.
in this case, it kind of the opposite of, okay, I don't want to say the wrong thing or do the
Yeah.
wrong thing, so I'm just going to do nothing, which of course, in the time when somebody needs something from you, then not doing
Yeah.
anything can be the harmful option.
Yeah.
And also, I do want to talk more about at the school level, like the resources that need to be made available, right? And the opportunities for teachers to refer students for
Yes.
appropriate care when needed, but that
Mhm.
there are a lot of just small day-to-day things and all the interpersonal dynamics that are going
Mhm.
on, or grief and just other things that
Yes.
are happening,
Yes.
that necessarily require or don't exclusively require mental health care, but
Yeah.
need
Yes.
caring, people in positions of authority to have some awareness and to
Mhm.
be present and demonstrate that they're present, but without putting too much pressure and fear around it, right? I think it
Mhm.
does make sense to think about that sometimes you need to take some form of action. It might be a small
Yeah.
action, it might be a
Mhm.
couple of small words, but that if you're operating by, let me just not do anything, let me not get involved with this at all because it's not my area of expertise,
Yeah.
that could perpetuate some of the challenging
Yes.
environments and dynamics that foster some
Mhm.
of the mental health struggles that kids do have.
Absolutely. And I think your example of grief is a really good one because it's something that we don't know what to do with. So if a student has someone in their life pass away, and what usually happens is that, and this is true for adults too, we don't know what to say. We don't know what they're going through. We think if we bring it up, we'll trigger them and that'll make them more sad. And we forget that that's on their mind anyway. It's not like they're going to forget that this happened because we don't bring it up, but there is that paralysis. And so what happens often when a student is grieving is either are left with the experience of, does no one even care about this? Or they're left with the experience of, oh, I hate these pitying looks I'm getting. And I know people are kind of looking at me like now there's something wrong with me. And I hate it. Those are typically two reactions that students will have. And so when you think about that, this is a really awful experience in a student's life. But if that's their experience after, it compounds and it compounds. And then what does that lead to? And how does that not only for their mental health, but also their school life? Like, do they become more withdrawn in class? Are they able to focus less? And then this becomes a problem academically as well. Whereas as an educator, if you do know those few words, again, it's not much, but just knowing, hey, I can just let this student know I'm thinking about them. And there's a few things I can say that I know are going to be helpful or that open the door. I use that language in the book a lot. Just open the door for their own self-reflection, for their own communication, not pressuring them to talk about it. But we can say a few things that don't feel pressuring for students, but that do let them know, oh, here is a safe person I could talk to, or here's someone that gets me, or that I can feel safe and comfortable with. And the difference between that, and there's so much research that supports this, kids really only need one person, whether that's a peer or a teacher or someone. They only need one person in a school setting that cares about them. Not even that knows the right thing to say or connects them to resources. They just need someone that cares. And when they feel that, everything changes. And again, it's the difference between being in an environment where you think you're alone and isolated versus being in an environment where you've got a partner in this. And maybe there's some challenges as well. That's very different. And so again, it's just, because of course mental health is not in the sphere of education per se, but when you put examples like that, you go, oh, right. So if I just could say a few things, this student would actually not only thrive more in their life, but be able to engage in my class more. My job as a teacher becomes easier, the class dynamic becomes better, and the whole school system thrives more. So then you start to see, okay, this really is woven into the role, as long as we really clearly define what are those things that we're needing to do and how do we empower teachers to do those things.
I don't know if this is oversimplified or just wrong. You can tell me, but I guess one way I might say it is, if the reason why you're not willing to say something or address something is because it's uncomfortable for you, that's a
Mhm.
bad reason. Right?
Yeah, I think
There's
that's
those fears, and we've probably all dealt with that at some point, where
mhm,
that somebody had something happen,
mhm,
and you're
mm,
like, I don't really feel like bringing this up because
yeah,
the
yes,
situation might get out of hand, right? It might,
yeah,
some people think of it as, I don't want to make them upset, but the reality
yes,
is, oh, they're already upset. And
hmm,
by you demonstrating your care, it might just make them feel safe to
yeah,
open up about that, right?
yes,
And that with students in school, and this applies all the way on up to adults that have bosses and supervisors and colleagues, right? Having somebody that you feel like actually wants you to come to them when you need
yeah,
support makes a big difference. And knowing that, not that that you need it every day,
mhm,
but and not somebody that needs to constantly solicit it from you, but to say,
mhm,
look, if I need something, I can go to this person, tell them what's happening,
mhm,
and I know that they see that as their role. They're interested in helping to support
mhm.
that, and whatever needs to be done, that makes everybody feel a lot more secure where they are.
And I think you raise an interesting point about if I'm not doing it because it makes me uncomfortable, that's not a great reason. And I would add to that that this also then becomes the responsibility of the school system, because if an educator is in a school system and their principal or their superintendents, there's not this space of vulnerability and support that's shown to them, that's a big ask, you know? So I think this is another important part of this conversation, is that it needs to come from the ground up, but also from the top down, that there needs to be that space for educators to feel like, oh, somebody is asking me, and having these uncomfortable conversations and opening the door for them, that then role models and creates a space in the whole school system to be able to do the same. And I think that's an important thing, that it's not just put on teachers of do it even though it's uncomfortable. Yes, we all have to do that, but that becomes a lot easier if you have a whole school and you have a principal that shows up and says, I want to have the uncomfortable conversations too, even though it's hard for me. Then all of a sudden, that's a way easier ask. And so I think that's an important part of that conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's an important point, is that with anything that teachers do, another thing that is likely to hold them back is if they feel like they're not going to be supported when they make a
Yeah,
decision. And
absolutely.
okay, if I ask this student how they're doing, and then their reaction is something unanticipated, right? And then it gets elevated, and then
Mhm.
administration is not backing me up, and I'm not going to say anything that might get me in trouble. Or,
Yeah.
and that applies to any
Hmm.
part of their job, certainly it apply.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's hard to try something, right, to take a risk
Yeah.
when you know that nobody likely has your back, or you're going to get
Hmm.
thrown under the bus for it. You're going to be
Hmm.
very conservative,
Yeah.
and that's not really a thriving
Hmm.
environment for professionals to be able to make professional decisions based on their experience and their instinct, and
Hmm.
understanding that there's a good rationale for this,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
doesn't mean that we can always control the outcome, or there might be somebody who just decides they don't like the way we went about it, or we just might not get the result. But I can certainly justify my
Yeah.
logic and my
Yes.
intent,
Hmm.
and anything to do with mental health and social emotional, you know, characteristics is going to be variable. And
Yeah.
there's no guarantee of what the outcome is,
Hmm.
or how it works, or sometimes how somebody responds to just hearing the same thing from who the person who says it, and all of those things. But that it is, and I think I guess that's a good place to go, is kind of trying to illustrate sort of from the top down what the infrastructure in a sense would should look like in a school, to have one, like leadership that is creating the conditions
Hmm.
for mental health to be appropriately addressed and discussed,
Hmm.
making whatever resources need to be made available beyond that, and then we can fit in the teachers and their role of what, what they can address, what they should have other resources to be able to direct students toward, right? But I guess it starts at that leadership level to really talk explicitly about, I mean, there's modeling, right, walking the walk, as you said, and actually
Hmm.
treating teachers the same way, but then explicitly addressing, this is what we're going to do here. This is how we're going to go
Hmm.
about it. These are
Hmm.
the resources that are available when needed, but
Hmm.
these are the decisions that you are equipped to make and that you're trusted to make. And we
Hmm.
can have an ongoing dialogue about that. Or if you're not sure about something, we talk about it, whatever that looks like. But let's get it out there, and not just have everybody doing their own thing, or everybody afraid to do anything, or whatever that looks like.
Definitely. And you're absolutely right. There needs to be a cohesive strategy in the district. There also needs, so one of the things that I see as really challenging in districts, especially in the US, so I know I work with districts in a few other places in the world, but is there's a lot of focus in mental health at the tier 2 and 3 level. So when you notice students are struggling, let's refer them to that professional. And that's fantastic and that's really important. But what's missing in a lot of cases is mental health at the tier 1 level. And this is where teachers feel disempowered because they aren't given the resource that they can use with their students, all their students. And this is that whole thing of mental health is universal. If we wait until we see the signs and symptoms, we're going to miss most students. And that puts a lot of burden on teachers to be able to identify. And then we kind of miss the point. Are we trying to identify mental health, or are we trying to prevent challenges and create a skill set? And so that's one of the things that leaders really can do is create time. This is the most important thing in schools, especially as it gets up to middle and high school where there's so much less time. But there needs to be a mental health class. There needs to be classes where we're teaching a skill set. This is a skill set to know how to recognize and change, unhelpful thoughts, how to recognize our own stress responses, how to navigate interpersonal challenges. This is not something you can just have one speaker come in and done, check the box. You can't just offer a resource and expect students to access it outside of class time. Just like if we want students to learn to read and write, we teach them every single year, and we make lots of class time for it because we know it's a complicated skill set that needs a lot of practice. So that's one of the things that I'm most passionate about, is bringing that mental health in at that tier 1 level. And so that's what our classroom resources are all about. And then this book is the complement for, okay, if we're explicitly teaching mental health skills to all of our students, we know they have this baseline. Now let's make sure that teachers can also navigate those incidental things that come up. So we need to attack it from both sides, because if we're just doing one or the other, we're not creating this whole picture, and we're expecting that we're going to catch all those students that are struggling, or we're going to deal with it outside of the classroom, but it's in every classroom all the time. So I think that's a really important piece, that teachers need that class time, because that will indicate to them that this is something that's needed in the district and prioritized in the district, because we literally have a class that's dedicated to it.
Yeah. How is that done without time is a limited resource, right?
Yep.
Especially in schools. How can that be implemented in a way that's practical and that isn't detracting from other necessary time commitments?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do, and I think a lot of resources do this, is tied to cross-curricular competencies. So there are a lot of things that are in mental health that do relate to other subjects,
Mhm.
whether it's a health class, whether it's sort of English class, whether it's sort of around social studies, and there's lots of things that students are required to learn that really do relate to those mental health skills. So that's one piece, is making sure it's really tied in. Another piece is making sure that it's tied into district overall aims. So a lot of districts will have, mental health or well-being as a priority in the district.
Yeah.
And then it's just really making sure, okay, if that's your priority and you do really want that outcome, you are going to have to rethink what you're prioritizing at the classroom level. So it's a strategic kind of thinking of, okay, so we might have an assumption that there's nothing we can possibly cut from our class schedule. But if we really do value mental health, we might need to just rethink that a little bit and really consider what are the things that are necessary to meet our aims as a district. And so it is challenging, and it is something that needs to happen at those high levels. But as a society, we need to really be asking that question: can we afford not to make these changes? So just because it's always been done a certain way and we've always taught a certain amount of math and English, et cetera, and science, not to say that those things are not important, but do we need to rethink this a little bit? Do we need to get creative? So does it need to go in a homeroom period? Does it need to go in an advisory period? Do we need to rethink how our class structure works? And so there is that onus, and so many visionary district leaders are doing this. So it's really important to know that so many people are really doing it and are switched on. So it is possible. It's just making sure everybody knows that, and everybody knows this is, if we want that outcome, we are going to have to make some changes. And so there's that piece where, yeah, you can fit it in a lot of ways, but you also need to, again, it's that discomfort. We
Yeah.
can't avoid it just because it's uncomfortable, just because it's a pain to reorganize things, or there's going to be pushback and all those things. Sure, that's fine. But if we don't do it, what is the cost? If we just keep
Right.
status quo because it's easier, and we all know the cost. We see the cost every day, the devastation that happens from student mental health. It's that really kind of hard-hitting question to come back to.
Yeah. Yeah. And another element of being able to implement a plan here effectively that also relates to something the school leadership needs to be out front of, and it is the communication with parents, right, around what this is, what it looks like, why we're doing it, what our approach is.
Yeah.
Another source of, I think, probably often potential fear about who's going to have an opinion about who should and shouldn't be talking to kids about this.
Yeah.
Some of the specific, things you write about in the book, especially, right, gender identity, inclusiveness,
Mhm.
some of those types of things, that there's a lot of
Mhm.
fear mongering about it. There's a
Yeah.
lot of, I think, also deserved unease if a parent thinks that their child is more comfortable talking to somebody else other than them, and then it morphs into, who's initiating and all those kind of
Yeah.
things. But I think, again, another reason why teachers would avoid it entirely, unless there is a clear and explicit plan. School
Yeah.
leadership is communicating to parents and saying, look, this is our approach here. This is what we're doing. We're trying to
Yeah.
maintain a, but you really making it clear and above board, and not allowing the narrative to take shape on
Mhm.
its own, as with all other kinds of things. Again, like the importance of proactive communication, and really not hiding behind it, and being very clear about,
Mm.
here's the thought that goes into this, here's what we're attempting to do, here's why it's so important.
Mhm.
And if somebody has a disagreement, then we can discuss it, but we're
Mhm.
going to be talking about the same thing at
Yeah.
least, versus
Yeah.
we're,
Yeah.
we're not saying anything about what we're doing, and then somebody has one interpretation and it snowballs and becomes something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That transparency is so important. Parents knowing what's happening is vital, because it is really important that their children are not being taught things that they fundamentally disagree with and all of those things. That's a really important dialogue to open up. And in our experience, the more, at least with our resources, the more parents see them, and also making sure that there are resources for parents as well. That's one of the things that we really feel passionate about, that it's not just for the students or just for the teachers and the students, but it's also for the parents. So making sure that they're a part of it is really valuable in that. And the more they see it, the more they realize. It's usually, again, the word mental health is scary. But then when you actually go, oh, this is about helping my child navigate challenges, I can get behind that. And then the other piece of that that's really important in terms of sort of how do we do this in an education system is to move slowly. We don't have to solve this all in year one. And I think that's a part that can paralyze the system when it sort of seems like this huge beast, and you might have parents in the community that are opposed to it, or your teachers are feeling a little bit less comfortable. And then it's that thing of, okay, well, let's do nothing because it's too
Yeah.
hard. Really moving slowly. I've been watching SEAL Team and I love one of their taglines. Smooth is slow is fast, I think is how they say it. But it's that whole idea. No, slow is smooth is fast. That's how they do it. So the idea of, if you move slowly, it will go smoothly, and then in the end, you'll get that outcome that you want. So that's what we do when we work with districts, is let's not look at your 1 year rollout, let's look at your 5 year rollout. And let's just start really simply. Let's start with getting some of the shared language, making sure we're on the same page, start with some teacher training, start with some really light, simple concepts that are not going too deep, and know that if we start taking steps in the right direction, we are going to ruffle less feathers, and we're going to get everyone on board. It's going to be gentle enough that people don't feel blindsided, whether that's parents or teachers, and that we upskill everyone at the same time. And so in 5 or 10 years, we can go, yeah, we have this thriving district that where every student has these incredible mental health skills, because we did this slowly, and we're building up our students from pre-K all the way up. And then if we all did this, if we think about sort of the world we live in, if we all did this really slowly, in 10 or 20 years, imagine if every single child that's now in pre-K has had this, because when you introduce it when they're young, it's really simple. So it's gently at the older ages and really starting at those younger ages as well, so that everybody all of a sudden has this new skill set. And
Yeah.
then we're not trying to awkwardly have conversations with people that don't know how to have the conversation. They know it. They'll be so much better at it than we are. We'll be the
Right.
awkward ones, but they'll go, "Hey guys, we've been having these conversations our whole lives. We know this skill set." And that's what we want for our children's generation is that change and that empowerment.
Yeah. To give listeners like a real clear idea of how the book is presented, there's all of the various different behavior patterns that students might be exhibiting, and there's kind of the why, what, how. Can you just maybe talk through an example of that? And if I'm coming to the book, right, and I don't have a background in this, but I want to try it,
Yeah.
what am I going to take away from it?
Definitely. So I've really designed the book in a way that it's to be used as a handbook. So you don't need to read it cover to cover. You can literally have it in your classroom, have it at home. You encounter a student that, for example, is really anxious or has lost someone that they care about, or something's going on at home that's hard. So any number, you flip to the chapter in the book. So there's a series of chapters with all different, okay, here's students that are struggling with addictive patterns. So you see a student on their phone can never put their phone down. All these different examples. You just look through the chapters. What's the chapter that relates mostly to that situation I've seen? You flip to that chapter and you get a really clear framework. And it's the framework that's used throughout the book, but applied to each situation. So there's
Yeah.
6 core skills that really do apply everywhere, but you get to see it play out in each example. So, okay, here's the
Right.
6 skills. How does that apply to this specific example? And then the part that I love the most is you get to see a real dialogue. Because this is, again, the reason I wrote this book is because with all the educators I work with all over the world, I get asked that question of, can I have an example? Can I really see what am I really supposed to say here? Because a framework is really powerful, but we also need to see it in action. So they get a real dialogue, and that's bit of an interview that I've done with a student about this issue. And so they get to see it break down of how does this actually go in real life? Because again, in a perfect world, we would just say A, B, C, D, E, and we'd say it all perfectly and they'd get it and it'd be great. That's not how it works in real life.
Right.
So to see how it can go wrong, I give a lot of sort of notes of, oh, I wish I'd said this here, or they responded this way, so I tried this, and really just breaks it down to see that I don't do it perfectly, not in a million years. No one's going to do it perfectly, but that's okay. Here's how you say the next thing, or here's how you recover, or here's what you could say the next time. And so they really get this living example. And the purpose of that and the feedback I'm getting, which is really exciting, is it really helps to go, oh, okay, great. You're not expecting me to nail this and to have like the lingo down or anything. I can just, as long as I have this basic framework in my mind, I can stumble my way through it and have a really powerful impact. So that's the idea. So every chapter has that real interview example that they can sort of digest and then have that as their template when they're in that conversation the next time they see that student.
Yeah. And when we refer to, the why in this case, right? I mean, it's not
Mm.
theory and jargon are
Hmm.
not really what the book's about, right? Which
No.
is, I mean, maybe what some people they might have in their head when
Mm.
they think about something that's about mental health and written by
Hmm.
a clinical psychologist, and oh, this is going to be there are a lot of stuff that I don't really know much about, or it's not going to
Hmm.
be that practical. It's a lot about the theory, or it's a lot of lingo and terminology and things that, how do I put it to practical use?
Yeah.
And especially when we're talking about that practicality of what's the strategy, how might I use it, it's
Hmm.
important to put that in terms that are going to carry over,
Yes.
because that's right on a day-to-day basis don't really happen according to theory. There's a lot of theory behind it and how these strategies were developed, but right now, like, I have to deal with what's in front of me and just think about, how do I do this, right?
Exactly. And that's exactly right. And I wrote this book with educators with that lens. And for that purpose, also for me, myself, when I'm engaging with something, I don't like, you need to know that there's a sound theory behind it, but that's not going to help you in the moment.
Yeah.
It's what do I actually do? And that's true with anything we do in life. If we're trying to make a change for ourselves or learn something, we just need the steps. We need the steps. We need to know that there's a framework, and we need to know that there's something we can remember and recall. And so that's the idea of this. Again, it's like that handbook that you can hopefully just keep flipping to and go, okay, great, I'll try one little thing here. And then the more you use it, the more intuitive it becomes, and the more it just becomes second nature. And that's the goal. It's like if you encounter something and you wish you could just ask someone, hey, what can I say here? And that's the idea of the book. It can be that person to say, here's a few suggestions. Why don't you try that? And then you get to judge your students best, what's happening, but you have that evidence that you are doing something that is evidence-based, that is something that intuitively makes sense. And then you start to see it in action. You start to see, hey, this is really having an impact. And then hopefully you feel better about going home at the end of the day and knowing I did make an impact. And I know that. And I don't have to worry about that student so much because I know I did what I can do to help them.
Excellent. Well, Hayley, for our listeners interested in taking the next step with this, of course, they can get the book, and we'll put the link to that here. Anything else they should check out?
Yeah, they can absolutely check out our website, openparachuteschools.com, which has more information about the book on it. Also, our classroom-based resources for teaching those tier 1 skills. And then they can also find me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with educators and chatting about all things mental health.
Excellent. Well, listeners out there, we'll put the links below. You can learn more at the website openparachuteschools.com. You can also get the book Finding the Words from Wiley or wherever you get your books. So we'll put the link there below. But if you like to go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc., you can certainly find it there. We'll have Hayley's in profile linked as well. So connect any and all of those places to learn more and to get the resources to put this to use. You also, please, if you haven't already, subscribe to The Authority for more author interviews coming your way every week, or visit bepodcast.network to learn about all of our shows. Hayley, thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.